Lena was curled next to me, one hand softly trailing over my chest in absent-minded spirals. We weren't talking, just being, suspended somewhere between comfort and curiosity. Then she said it. "Do you remember the first time I warped your sofa?" I blinked. "You mean the first time? As in, it's happened more than once?" She chuckled, her voice muffled slightly against my t-shirt. "You only noticed once. The first time was before we even had a first date." Now she had my full attention. "Wait, what? You warped my furniture before we were even together?" She pulled back slightly to look at me, eyes shimmering with mischief. "You really don't remember?" "Lena," I said slowly, "you can't just drop a casual pre-relationship sofa alteration and expect me to not interrogate you." So she told me it was at that horrendously awkward startup mixer where we first crossed paths. I was presenting a demo of my neural cloud sync prototype, wearing a blazer I'd borrowed from a friend who was 2 inches taller and had much better shoulders. The whole thing was going terribly. My software had glitched mid-demo and started syncing everyone's search history into the same shared screen. Yes, everyone. Panic, screaming. One guy ran out crying after his tab labeled, "Do ducks get bored?" appeared on screen next to a woman's, "Should I text him or eat cereal?" I was mortified. And then I saw her. She was standing at the back, sipping what looked like glowing orange soda through a straw shaped like a Fibonacci spiral. She wasn't laughing. She was smirking, in that cosmic, "I already know how this ends" kind of way. When the chaos subsided, I found her sitting on the sofa in the lounge area, legs crossed, levitating slightly. I sat on the other end, trying to pretend I hadn't just involuntarily created the most awkward group therapy session in startup history. "You didn't run," I remember saying. She looked at me. "I don't run from glitchers. I date them." I thought it was a joke. I laughed. She didn't. Then, mid-conversation, my sofa shifted, not like a creak or a sag. It breathed. It gently reformed, subtly around me. It curved like a pod, held my spine a little straighter, made my back feel less like a knotted question mark. I blinked. "You did that," I said. She sipped her drink. "Your posture offended me." We talked for 3 hours. We debated wormhole ethics. She teased me about my laugh. I teased her about her socks. They didn't match. And she said it was intentional polarity disturbance. I was hooked. When I stood to leave, the sofa whispered a soft tone, as if saying goodbye. I never forgot that moment. I just didn't know why it had felt so strange. Now lying beside her on Saturn, I stared at her in disbelief. "That was you." She nodded, smug. "I tested the field integrity of your living room. Wanted to see if you were the kind of man who notices when his furniture has been subtly upgraded." I laughed. "And what did you conclude?" "You didn't notice for months, but you offered me half your fries, even though you didn't know me. So I let it slide." She snuggled in closer. "And you kept sitting in the same spot," she added softly, "like you trusted it." I kissed the top of her head. "I didn't trust the sofa." She looked up. "I trusted the gravity." It's funny how relationships are like that. You think it's all about the big things, romantic gestures, deep conversations, love declarations across planetary distances. But sometimes it starts with a sofa, a shifted seat, a subtle support, a woman with space-bending powers and a deeply selective sense of humor. And you don't even realize you've begun falling until the gravity adjusts. In that flashback, in that breath of time stitched into the fabric of who we were becoming, something changed. She warped the sofa, and I, unaware, awkward, utterly human, sat down anyway. Now, years and light years later, I finally understood what that meant. The morning after our orbiting dinner in cosmic confessionals, we were floating somewhere between actual peace and the kind of quiet that usually precedes a cosmic punchline. And the punchline arrived in the form of an alert. Incoming transmission, Outer Regulatory Network. Source, Galactic Zoning and Occupation Division, GZOD. Status, Unauthorized Residential Object, detected in planetary orbit risk level. Intermediate, emotional plus gravitational. Response initiated, intervention pending. Lena stared at the blinking wall display, eyes narrowing. I sipped my space coffee, now only faintly humming, and tilted my head like someone trying to process both a legal threat and the fact that my girlfriend's hair was currently glowing red-orange. That's not good, is it? I asked. She took a slow breath. Not yet, but it's about to be. I leaned forward. Are we being evicted from Saturn? Not exactly. Clarify. There's a treaty, she said, swiping a hand through the air to pull up a holographic scroll. The Galactic Residential Displacement Accord. Section 19 prohibits non-declared dwelling units from entering planetary orbit without emotional stabilization clearance. I blinked. Are you saying our apartment is too emotionally unstable to be in space? Yes, she said. It's emitting residual tension frequencies. That's absurd. Is it? She replied, raising an eyebrow. Remember the mug? Touché. She paced the room, her cloak fluttering as the gravity fluctuated slightly. I felt a small pull on my socks. She was thinking hard. They're going to send an inspection drone, she said, possibly with enforcement units. If they detect emotional anomalies, they'll initiate deconstruction. Deconstruction? As in they'll break the apartment down into its base particles and recycle it into raw emotional minerals for black hole therapy programs. I dropped my mug. It floated gently downward, unharmed, but still. No, I said. No, no, no. We've been through too much. This couch is emotionally significant. That spice rack over there? That's where you accidentally vaporized the chili flakes and we cried together for 20 minutes. She nodded. Exactly. Which means we have to protect it. I stood. How? She turned toward me, face lit with the kind of intensity usually reserved for planetary negotiations, or when someone messes up her espresso order. We stabilize the field, together. You mean couple therapy again? No, she said. Something bigger. She pulled open the hall closet and revealed a glowing orb the size of a beach ball, swirling with stardust and tiny flashing glyphs. This, she explained, is a harmonic resonance core. It syncs emotional frequencies between cohabiting beings and stabilizes environments. If we can calibrate it, the inspection drones will scan a healthy emotional signature and pass us. I frowned. And how do we calibrate it? She looked at me, suddenly nervous. By syncing our memories. I stared. Like, together? It's intimate and raw and slightly invasive, but it might be the only way. Sounds like marriage counseling with more lasers. Basically, we knelt on either side of the orb. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat made of stars. She reached for my hands. I took them. The orb flared. Immediately, I was hit with a surge of memories. Our first walk in Central Park, her boots floating just slightly above the grass. The night she built me a personal meteor shower because I said I missed fireworks. The first time she cried and the air pressure in the apartment dropped so fast the windows fogged. And then her memories. Her fear, the first time she told me she wasn't entirely human compatible. Her joy when I didn't flinch. Her sadness when I forgot to ask how her planetary conference went. The way she looked at me when I sang off-key while making pancakes. It was overwhelming, honest, electric. Tears slid down my cheeks. Okay, I whispered. I get it. I'm sorry. For all of it. I'm sorry too, she said. I didn't mean to make you feel small. I just didn't want to feel invisible. The orb flashed gold. Emotional stability, synchronized 92%. Environmental clearance, temporary granted. We looked up. The inspection drone, spherical, silver, and covered in tiny bureaucratic blinking eyes, hovered outside the window. It scanned, paused, and floated away. We let go of the orb. It dimmed and slowly dissolved into sparkles. Well, I said, wiping my eyes, that was intimate. She smiled. Your memories are louder than mine. You have more color. We sat quietly for a moment, side by side on the couch, holding hands like nothing had ever been out of place. I think, I said softly, this is the most romantic space violation notice I've ever received. It's also your first, she pointed out. I shrugged. You always remember your first. And outside, Saturn turned slowly beneath us, its rings glittering like a giant wedding band, from a god we hadn't yet named. It was the following morning when Lena announced, over coffee and an impressively stable gravity field, that she'd filed for a planetary reintegration license. I nearly dropped my toast. Wait, I said. We're going back to Earth? She nodded, sipping her blue tea. The apartment's cleared, the emotions are synced, and we've passed the Galactic Emotional Zoning Review Board. We're allowed to re-enter planetary atmosphere. That sounds fast. I may have called in a favor from a friend in Sector 14. She owes me a life debt from that time I prevented a sentient crystal uprising on her moon colony. I blinked. You are the most casually terrifying person I know. I'm flattered. She tossed me a small silver disc. What's this? I asked. A retrofitted re-entry stabilizer, she said. It'll anchor the apartment as it descends through Earth's gravity field. I caught it awkwardly. You're saying we're going to land the apartment? Yes. Like a building. Through the atmosphere. Yes. In New York. Give or take a few miles, I stared at her. Define few. She grinned. We'll see. The next few hours were spent prepping for descent, which is to say Lena performed complex calculations in the air using glowing equations and motion-coding glyphs while I packed snacks and moved the cat's litter box away from the bathroom vent. Remind me again, I said as I strapped myself to the couch with an old seatbelt she conjured from a defunct Starship model. What happens if we overshoot? We bounce. Bounce? Off the atmosphere. Like a rock on a pond? Like a house on a trampoline? I am not reassured. She smirked, flicked her fingers, and activated the stabilizer. A low hum filled the room. The apartment's walls glowed faintly. Outside the window, Saturn slowly rotated out of view, replaced by a familiar speck in the distance. Earth. It looked smaller than I remembered, but brighter. The descent began gently at first, like sinking into a warm bath made of starlight. Then things got turbulent. Books rattled, couch cushions flared up like startled pigeons. The toaster briefly achieved sentience, declared itself emotionally unprepared, and then shut down. Is this normal? I shouted over the vibration. Lena, still calm, floating upside down as if the laws of physics were just a polite suggestion, nodded. Totally normal. We're entering the lower troposphere. The apartment bucked slightly. A plant flew by. I don't even know what troposphere means, I yelled. It means, she began, but was cut off by the entire apartment lurching sideways. We hit something. Not hard, but enough to knock my glasses sideways and send our framed first wormhole together photo spinning into the kitchen. I opened my eyes slowly. Silence. Then a thud. Then birds, lots of birds, and a child yelling, Mom, the sky house is back. I unbuckled myself, stood shakily, and looked out the window. We'd landed, mostly on a patch of green, a large patch, with a hot dog vendor, and a horse, and about 30 tourists filming us with their phones. We were in Central Park. Again, only sideways. The apartment had landed at a 30-degree tilt, wedged gently between two elm trees and what I hoped was a dry fountain. A flock of pigeons had claimed the balcony, and a jogger had paused to take a selfie with our front door. Lena appeared beside me. Well, she said brightly, you wanted to come home. I turned to her. We landed in a park. It's close to your favorite bagel place. I blinked. You did this on purpose, didn't you? She smiled. The front door beeped. Warning, structural tilt detected. Proceed with awkward optimism. We opened it. Outside, people clapped. A saxophonist began playing something suspiciously romantic. Someone handed Lena a coffee. She accepted it with a nod. I looked at her, at our crooked interplanetary apartment, at the crowd now treating us like returning space royalty. And I felt something strange. Pride. I miss this weird planet, I said. You always did, she replied, even when you pretended you didn't. We stepped outside together, waving, surrounded by trees and dogs and New Yorkers, pretending they weren't impressed. And even though the apartment had landed a little off target, we hadn't. We'd landed together, which, all things considered, was exactly right. The apartment was tilted for 3 days, not in a dangerous way, just noticeably off balance. The kind of tilt that made cereal bowls slide gently to the left side of the table and chairs lean into philosophical conversations they weren't invited to. Every visitor felt it. Chloe came by and said, "It's like your furniture is still emotionally processing." She wasn't wrong. Even gravity, it seemed, needed time to settle back into itself. Lena and I did our best to resume normal Earth life, which after orbiting Saturn was like trying to go back to decaf after drinking espresso made from lightning. The apartment was still functional, power, plumbing, ambient temperature regulation, but it now smelled faintly of ozone and roasted nostalgia. Also, the cat kept staring at the walls like it expected them to whisper secrets. One morning I found Lena standing in what used to be our living room window. Only now, it looked out into space. Not a projection, not a screensaver. A real-time, stabilized wormhole lens fixed permanently on the edge of Saturn's rings. "What is that?" I asked, blinking sleep from my eyes. She didn't turn around. "A window." "To where exactly?" "To where we were." I stepped beside her. The view shimmered like memory and glowed like something freshly forgiven. "You built a wormhole in our window frame?" I asked. "Technically, it's a harmonic lens built into a perception-folded aperture." Then she looked at me and smiled. "But yes, a window." I stared at it. The rings spun slowly, the same faint stardust shimmer, a silence so deep it felt like a language only hearts could hear. "It's beautiful," I said, "and also kind of terrifying." "Like love," she said softly. We stood there in silence, watching something far away that somehow still felt close. "It's not always open," she added, "just when we need it. Like when we forget." "Forget what?" She looked at me then, her expression softer than starlight. "That we've already survived the hardest part." The days returned to rhythm, but not the old one. This was new, different. We left the window open more often, not always for the view, but for what it reminded us of. That distance can mean growth. That gravity, like relationships, isn't always constant. But what matters is the pull you choose. Lena started working with a research group on temporal healing spaces, therapeutic rooms that bend time slightly to help people process grief in slow motion. I started teaching part-time, finally saying yes to the community college job I'd ignored for months. They let me rename the intro coding course to Binary Love Letters and Logic Loops. I cried when I got my own office. She warped the desk into a crescent shape to celebrate. We still argued about dish soap, about music volume, about whose turn it was to recalibrate the compost chute. But we learned that "I'm fine" was usually code for "please listen closer." That silence wasn't always distance. That floating isn't the same as running away. And sometimes late at night, we'd sit in front of the Saturn window with mugs of something warm and weird. Not talking, not fixing, just watching. Letting the rings spin, letting memory orbit, letting love settle in like gravity that had finally found the right direction, and it no longer mattered where we were, because we were finally home. It was a Tuesday when we decided to write a domestic treaty. Technically, Lena called it an interdimensional cohabitation addendum, but I insisted we call it what it really was, a relationship rulebook. Not a rigid one, not laminated, just something soft and flexible, like an emotional user manual with cosmic footnotes. We wrote it on the kitchen wall, literally. The dry erase surface she installed could bend to store multidimensional timelines, but it also took regular markers, so we stood there, her in her floating socks, me in an oversized hoodie, and wrote out the new terms of living together after orbit. Rule number 1, mugs are mortal, rinse them. Rule number 2, no gravitational punishment unless specifically requested. Rule number 3, 1 crisis per week, preferably not planetary. Rule number 4, if either of us phases out of reality, leave a note, or snacks, or both. Rule number 5, clause 17.1, talk before you teleport. I underlined that one. She added a little doodle of our apartment with tiny rocket boosters and a speech bubble that said, "Consent first." We laughed for 10 minutes. That night we celebrated the treaty with Earth-style pancakes and a Bayloran truth syrup drizzle that made every compliment sound accidentally too poetic. At one point, I looked at her and said, "You are the celestial translation of comfort wrapped in a morning horizon." And she responded by nearly choking on a blueberry. Things felt real. Not the shiny kind of real you see in movies where everyone knows the perfect thing to say, but the clumsy, lopsided kind. The kind where you spill syrup on the treaty wall and decide not to clean it because the stain looks a little like a heart. Lena, ever the cosmic romantic disguised as a scientist, suggested we sign the wall, not digitally, not symbolically, with fingerprints. So we dipped our thumbs in the remaining syrup and pressed them onto clause 17.1. There, right next to talk before you teleport. "I like it," I said. "It's binding across at least 3 galaxies," she said proudly. "Think anyone else has a treaty like this?" She shook her head. "Most couples just go to therapy. We rewrite reality." "Romantic," I said. "Ridiculous," she replied. We agreed it was both. Later, she fell asleep on the couch beside me, curled like a question I already knew the answer to. The apartment hummed softly, sinking to her breathing. Outside the Saturn window, the stars did their slow cosmic ballet. And as I watched her sleep, warm, glowing faintly from the truth syrup, with one foot floating just above the cushion, I realized something. We hadn't just returned to Earth. We'd made Earth bigger, more flexible, more forgiving. The kind of planet that could contain both sarcasm and stardust, burnt toast and time portals, and 2 stubborn people learning every day how to share the same gravity without pulling each other apart. The mug was clean, the window was open, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of floating. I was afraid of forgetting how far we'd come. So I added one last rule to the wall, under her sleeping smile. Rule number 6, remember the rings. Not because we went to Saturn, but because we came back, together. There are moments in every relationship where you know something shifted, not in a dramatic way, not like an explosion or a betrayal or a cosmic relocation, though in our case, sure, we had those too. But I'm talking about the smaller shifts, the kind that don't announce themselves, but change the gravity forever. Ours came on a Sunday morning. Birds outside the window were chirping like nothing had ever happened. New Yorkers strolled past our sideways parked apartment, casually pretending that our Saturn-orbiting living room wasn't now a permanent fixture in Central Park. Children tossed frisbees dangerously close to the wormhole window. Someone had even graffitied, "Alien love is real" on our recycling chute. Inside, Lena stood barefoot on the ceiling, not because of a glitch. She just felt like it. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, watching her from the usual floor perspective. She'd been up there for 20 minutes, reading a Bayloran romance novel upside down, with a floating croissant orbiting her head like a pastry moon. "You good up there?" I asked. She nodded. "Gravity's overrated. Perspective's everything." I smiled. "Want to come down?" She considered it. "Only if you promise not to drink the rest of the syrup." I lifted the bottle. "No promises." She floated downward slowly, kissed the top of my head mid-descent, then settled beside me like she'd never been upside down at all. Just like that. Like it was nothing. Like our relationship hadn't gone from passive-aggressive silence to planetary relocation and back again. Like she hadn't literally rewritten the rules of physics to avoid a difficult conversation. Like I hadn't needed Saturn's rings to understand that intimacy isn't about knowing what to say, it's about choosing to stay. And maybe that was the magic of it all. We stayed. After the mug, after the fight, after the descent in the treaty, and the orbital pizza, and the gravity therapy. We stayed. But it wasn't just about surviving chaos. It was about building through it. So that morning, between toast bites and telepathic coffee refills, I looked at Lena and said, "I want to do something weird." She didn't even flinch. Define weird. "I want to make a mixtape." She blinked. "A what?" "A playlist," I corrected. "An Earth tradition. You collect songs that remind you of someone, or a feeling, or a season of life, and then you give it to them." She looked intrigued. "You want to give me music?" "I want to give you us in sound." She tilted her head. "What's the title?" I smiled. "Track 12. We spent the rest of the day curating it, song by song, memory by memory. Track 1, the song that was playing during our first kitchen dance battle. Track 2, the music from the first time she tried Earth-style ice cream and temporarily lost her ability to hover. Track 3, that one weird track from Sector 9 that makes your bones tingle in the key of C. Track 4, a lo-fi remix of My Apology for Forgetting Her Anniversary. Track 5, a Bayloran ballad translated into English by a robot who misunderstood half the metaphors and somehow made it better. Track 6, the silent track. 4 minutes of space hum, meant for sitting, for remembering. Track 7, a chaotic mashup of all the alarms from when the apartment first tilted during re-entry. Track 8, rain, just rain, because sometimes you need a storm without the drama. Track 9, the song we never finished writing together. Track 10, her laugh, looped softly under piano. Track 11, the melody of her voice reading Clause 17.1. Track 12, nothing but Saturn win. We didn't share it publicly, not this one. This was ours, stored in a tiny stardust drive, sealed with a fragment of our old mug and tucked into a drawer next to our thumb-printed treaty wall. Something to play when the gravity got weird again. That night I stood alone at the Saturn window. The stars looked smaller now, not because they were dimmer, but because I was fuller. The kind of full that only comes when someone sees you completely, yells at you lovingly, relocates your apartment during a fight, and still chooses to cook you floating pizza afterward. She came up behind me, wrapped her arms around my waist. "Still looking out there?" she asked. I nodded, just making sure it's still there. She rested her chin on my shoulder. "It always is. You just have to look up." And we stood there, in a crooked apartment on a tilted Earth, with a permanent wormhole view of the coldest planet I'd ever called home, together. Because love doesn't always make sense, but it does leave gravity, and I'd rather float sideways forever with her than land straight with anyone else. Hey, you. Yeah, you, the one still listening. Tell me something. Have you ever been in a fight so dumb, so petty, so tiny that you couldn't explain why it hurt so much? A mug, a late reply, a forgotten date, a dish in the sink. It's never about the thing, is it? It's about feeling seen, heard, considered. Sometimes it takes a planetary relocation to learn how to say, "I'm sorry." Sometimes it just takes listening before things explode, or before they drift too far to catch. So let me ask you, what's your Saturn? What was your moment that felt like too far, and yet somehow became the reason you grew closer? Tell us in the comments, because the universe is huge, but every story, every orbit, every mug left too long on a windowsill, it all matters. This has been Alien Love Stories. We'll see you in the next one. And until then, talk before you teleport and remember the rings.